Welcome to The Human Experience, a podcast about the stories we live out every day and the importance of championing the vulnerability and courage of the storyteller. I'm your host, Jennifer Peterkin, and it was through my own lived story of experiencing domestic violence that this podcast was created. By traveling the globe and interviewing each guest in person, I am convinced now more than ever that stories have the power to change the world. You can join our community of storytellers by subscribing, leaving a rating and review, signing up for my newsletter, following me on Instagram, and more. Thank you for being here. In a world full of noise, to listen with intention is an act of resistance. Well, Linda, thank you so much for having me in your home to do this interview in Virginia. It's lovely to be here. You have a lovely home.
Thank you so much. And thank you for coming all this way. It's just a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for our conversation. I'm excited to hear about your story. I obviously know a very little bit, the background and everything, but it just sounds so interesting. And I love what I love about your story, in theory, at least, because I have not heard it yet, is the generational aspect of it.
Yes.
I think that it is so great when we can talk about generations and how the impact that has, as we move through life, and we are always impacted by the generations that come before us. So.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And I don't think we always realize that.
No.
We do carry a lot of trauma, certainly, from past generations, and of course, the good stuff too.
Yeah.
So.
we get it all, right?
Yeah,
the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's life.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, okay, so we're in Virginia now. Is that where you are from originally?
No,
okay.
I grew up in Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
Yeah. So I grew up in Buffalo. I'm the middle child of 7 children.
Wow.
So big family. And my parents were, shall I say, refugees. They came from Hungary. Mm-hmm. And they came in 1949. So it was after the war, not right after the war, but we can get into what they did in between.
Yeah.
And they first moved to Philadelphia, and then later on were recruited. They're both physicians. And they were recruited by Roswell Park because at the time, Roswell Park was just building a huge cancer center. And my father's an oncologist and my mother was a hematologist. So they both worked at Roswell Park. And just to give you a little, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but last year in May, I went back to Buffalo because Roswell Park it's become a huge complex. And on one of the walls, they did a mural honoring 3 Hungarians who all 3 were righteous Gentiles. And just so your listeners understand what a righteous Gentile is, it's the righteous among the nations is the highest honor that the Israeli government can give non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust.
Oh.
So 3 Hungarians, 3 righteous Gentiles, 3 made Buffalo their home, and my mother was one of those.
Wow.
So she's got a beautiful mural on Roswell Park in Buffalo.
That's lovely.
Yeah, it's really quite an honor.
Yeah.
Quite a beautiful thing. So, yeah.
Now, were any of your siblings born in Hungary? When did your parents come
No,
over?
my parents came in 1949, and then they moved to Philadelphia. My 3 older sister and 2 brothers were born in Philadelphia. Then I was born in Buffalo, and my 3 younger were born in Buffalo.
Okay.
So yeah.
So yeah, I mean, they were, I don't want to skip in your story. I don't want to reveal anything, before you do. So yeah, I guess given the context of what we're talking about today and the book that you wrote about your family, if I ask you, where does your story begin? What does that mean to you?
That's a great question because it actually, I grew up in Buffalo. So I'll take you back a little bit first. I grew up and just, we thought we were a normal family, except, my parents spoke Hungarian. My grandmothers lived with us. They spoke Hungarian. We did not have grandfathers. We had that picture hanging up in our dining room of my grandfather, but no one would talk about him and tell us about him.
Oh.
So we grew up and we were raised Catholic. We went to church every Sunday and we just thought we were a normal family. And then when I was in I think it was my late 20s, early 30s, it could have been, by accident, my older sister, who is a doctor, went to a medical meeting in Montreal. And when she was there, she stayed with her godmother. And her godmother, the families go back generations. They're Hungarian, and like her grandmother was my great-great-grandmother's best friend,
oh, wow.
kind of thing. So they really go back generations. And my sister asked her what she thought was a simple question. She asked, what was my great-grandmother Margit like? And the answer came back, well, like most Jewish women, she was strong and ruled the roost. So my sister sort of, I can imagine the look on her face because her godmother said, oops, I thought you knew. And that was how we found out that basically my father's family was Jewish. My father was Jewish.
Wow.
So she came back, and I remember, I'll never forget, she told my older brother, and I was coming home from, I don't know, business school or whatever I was doing. I came home for a break, and my brother came into my room. I was still unpacking, and my brother comes into my room, and he goes, I have a secret. And, it was like one of these things that you thought was going to, just explode. And he said, Dad's Jewish. And what was interesting, my reaction was sort of a non-reaction.
Yeah.
It was like almost, so what?
Yeah.
It didn't really make that much difference. I have to tell you, I was not a very good Catholic. So my parents went to church all the time. That sort of stopped after I left home. So it really didn't matter to me. But I immediately went to my mother and I said, is this true? And she said, yes, it's true. But my father actually, to his dying day, would never admit that to us.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So He just kept it to his grave. And I pushed him at various times and other people pushed him at various times, but he would never admit it. So at any rate, fast forward almost, 25, 30 years, about 8 years ago, or by now a little bit longer than that, in 2016, 2017, through the years, I had little things happen, and some little, some not so little. Like I went with my parents to Budapest, and this was shortly after I had found out, and I peppered my mother with questions, but found out later she only answered with sort of half truths. There was a lot she still left out, and then in 2006. My mother got the award of Righteous Among the Nations. So she had saved her best friend and numerous people, but one of those it all started with her closest girlfriend, and who is now was a world famous doctor in Sweden. And she and her husband are both world famous doctors, and they came from Sweden, and there was a meeting in Baltimore. So I went up to see them and ask her questions. And this happened twice. They came and I asked questions. But she gave me little pieces of information, but she would say, oh, it's just too painful. I can't talk about it. So I just got little bits and pieces. So with all of those little bits and pieces, by 2017, I was like, okay, I really need to find out something about my family. And the only thing I really knew was that way back, I come from a whole family of doctors. Not only my parents, but all my older siblings are doctors, and they're married to doctors, and it's, a lot of doctors in the family. So, but I do remember when my brother came home from medical school, and we were sitting in the living room, and he said, I want to be an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And my mother said, oh, you have a very famous relative who was considered the father of otology, and otology is the study of the ear. So, and she said his name was Adam Politzer. So that name always sort of stuck with me because I'd never heard the name Politzer connected with my family. So back to 2017, when I started to look, I started to, do some internet searches, see what was online. Adam Politzer has a lot online.
Okay.
But it's all in German. So I didn't speak in German, but he to this day, he is still considered the father of otology.
Oh, wow.
And he also, there's a Politzer Society that's named after him. It's a group of ear, nose, and throat doctors that still get together on a yearly or bi-yearly basis and meet. So, and there was a professor from Lausanne, Switzerland, who had written a big book about him. So I talked to that professor. I got the book. I read up on Adam Politzer, but I still didn't have any idea of how he was really connected to me. So back up a little bit again. I know I'm jumping around a little bit.
That's quite all right.
But in 2011, my parents' house had caught fire. And unfortunately, my mother died as a result of the fire. It was very tragic, but she had been in late stages of Alzheimer's, so that also contributed to it. But as a result of the fire, my sister was pulling out, paintings, like most of these paintings are of my parents behind you and in the other room and so on. So, she was pulling things out. So, they hadn't been destroyed by the fire, but she didn't want them destroyed by the water damage from the fire trucks. And she happened to pull out a box and didn't even realize it, because then it got stuck in the back of her closet. So then come 6 years later, I decide I want to research my family. And at the same time, she was cleaning out that closet and realized she had that box, and opened the box, and she said, a lot of papers and photographs and so on, all in Hungarian. So she sent the box to me. So I started to go through the box and realized that I needed a translator, and I needed more than a translator. But what happened, through a friend of a friend over a number of months, I was able to find a woman who lives in Rockville, about, half an hour away from here, who agreed to meet with me. So I took just one of the folders up from the box and took it to her. And she's just a remarkable woman. She's just wonderful. She's just bubbly, gregarious, just incredible. And she was amazed at what was in the folder. And I thought, I'd be there an hour. I was there all afternoon. And finally I said, I'm sorry, I have to leave because I have another commitment. But she was wonderful. And she said, some of these documents are historically very important, and you really need to have them researched. So she put me in touch with a number of people, and one of her good friends was named Andras Gazitsky, and he had done a previous exhibit about the Jews in a town called Papa in Hungary. And she said he would be the best person to help you research. And so that started what was a 3 or 4 year incredible relationship. He was such a remarkable sleuth, and he found out so many things. And so that's how it all started. I know I'm going on and on and on.
No,
so.
No, you are not. It's fantastic. I just am sitting here thinking, as you're talking, I'm visualizing it in my head, and it's almost playing out like a movie. And I'm like, this is the kind of thing where, people would watch this in a movie and be rolling their eyes, because that would never happen, right? Of course, the one box that gets saved from the fire wouldn't get put in the back of the closet only to be discovered. And I think it's just so indicative that, real life is stranger than fiction.
It is so true, because actually what's fascinating is, as we started our research, every little clue led to the next and the next and the next. And he, as I said, he was a remarkable sleuth. He found things that nobody else could find.
Wow.
But as a result of one of the letters, he found father's cousin's niece who still lived in Hungary, and he had several nieces still live in Hungary. And she told him she had a book that a great uncle had written. And with that book, we were able to go back and research 8 generations of the Politzer family. And as I said before, I didn't even know the name Politzer. I didn't know the name Misner. I didn't know any of these family names. And it turns out that they have just unbelievable stories. And now he wrote his it was a memoir, and it was, just really for the family, but it told these incredible stories going back to the 1700s. So, I'll give you an example. The first relative that he mentioned, his name was Isaac, and he was an incredible violin player. And he lived in an area that's now called No, not Galatia. Well, it's sort of the Upper Czech Republic is what it is today, and it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire was enormous and took up several of what we now know Eastern European countries.
Sure.
But so, at any rate, he was asked by his landlord. Now he was Jewish, and Jews at the time, they were not allowed. There were only so many allowed in one area because they didn't want to. The Jews at the time, Maria Theresa was the empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and she called the Jews a plague upon the empire, on the race. So you can imagine the anti-Semitism. I mean, it was horrible. Jews were treated terribly. They were taxed heavily. They weren't allowed to do certain professions, and even in some cases go to various schools and so on. So it was really very difficult living. So he was asked by his landlord to play a piece on Shabbat. And, according to Jewish law, you're not allowed to play music on Shabbat. So he refused, and they got in a huge fight. And, the fight went back and forth, and it got heated and heated and heated. And then finally, he says, even if Jesus Christ were here and asked me, I could not play the violin tonight. So at that, the landlord got upset and went back to the church, the priest, and said he used Christ's name in vain.
Oh.
And it went all the way up to Prague. And so then later on, the landlord sort of felt badly about this, but then the landlord came back. Then the priest went to the landlord and said, well, officials are coming down from Prague to serve justice. He's going to be burned at the stake.
Oh, geez.
So for using Christ's name in vain, he was to be burned at the stake. So the landlord sort of felt badly about this and told him and gave him money to escape. So that's sort of how, again, you go back to these movies. This was real. It feels like a fictional story, but that was my great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Wow.
8 generations back. So that's how it all started. And these stories were amazing. These people were amazing. They were Jewish. They were committed to their faith. Even in many circumstances, they were pressured to convert, but they never converted. Mm-hmm. And it seems like almost with every generation, they ended up in extreme poverty and built themselves back up and built, wealth. Mm. And then it got taken away again. So it was this, cyclical up and down. So, just the resilience of these people is so inspiring.
Wow.
It's really inspiring.
Yeah. That's amazing.
So, yeah. Yeah.
So you're researching all of this. How does that, I'm sure your mind is blown over and over again, but how does that make you feel in terms of your parents, realizing how much of your life or your history, I guess, has been hidden. I'm sure it's a very complicated feeling.
It was very complicated, and it was interesting because my father loved to tell stories, and I think my grandmother did too. And to realize that they were silenced was quite something. Now, my father was one of these. He was a bigger than life person. He was a doctor. He became very well known in the medical field worldwide, and certainly both my parents were very active in the Buffalo community, and so they were prominent, community figures. And my father loved to tell stories, but a lot of the stories we would roll our eyes because we would think, oh my God, he's just exaggerating the truth, shall we say. But when I look at these stories, it's like, had he just told us about his own family, he didn't need to exaggerate anything. So we'll go back to Adam Politzer, who was, as I said, he's still today considered the father of otology. Most ear, nose, and throat surgeons know who he is. Wow. And when I look at my father, he really modeled his career after Adam. So not only was Adam an incredible, he treated people like the Tsar of Russia and Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and King Leopold of Belgium. And yet most of these figures would not allow a Jew to treat them. And yet, Adam Politzer, he was not going to convert. He did not convert. So he was very strong in his faith. So he treated those kinds of people, but he also went into elderly care homes of these homes that housed very, very poor elderly, mostly Austrians, because he was living in Vienna, Austria. And he did a lot of incredible work with them. And he was an inventor. He invented something that's still used today. And I mean, but his true love was teaching. He was a professor at the university, and he loved to teach. And I look at my father, that was him to a T. And he published a lot too, so Adam Politzer, created the textbook of otology for its day, several textbooks, and he had hundreds of papers. Well, my father was the same. Yeah. So he really modeled his career after Adam, and yet he never spoke about him. And so it's a little, sad to think that he had this incredible relative, and yet he never spoke about him. So back to, I'm sorry. What was your question?
Don't apologize.
I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you did. It's just talking about how complicated it is to find this out. Were either of your parents alive when you started this journey?
My mother was not. My mother had died, but my father was. Okay. But we never told him. Okay. We kept it hidden because my sister was particularly protective of him, and she thought he would be very upset. Mm-hmm. So we never actually told him. And he was in his 90s at the time. So
that's fair.
Yeah.
Absolutely fair. But because, I imagine you live your entire life not talking about this for, whatever reason that he had. And I think that it's absolutely fair for you to want to know these things.
Yes.
But it's also equally fair for him to be able to live his life the way that he wanted to. Right. So I'm assuming that you learned about your parents' time in Hungary through this and through other.
Yes. Well, there was even more because the same niece, so going back to Andras and my father's cousin's niece, she told Andras about a book that his cousin wrote. And his
Andras.
My father's cousin.
Oh, that your father's cousin.
My father's cousin. So my father's cousin was 10 or 12 years younger than he. And he was actually autistic. So he was a musical genius, and, sort of your typical Dustin Hoffman character, the Rain Man. Mm-hmm. He was a musical genius, and he remembered everything, every little detail, but could not really understand emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote this book, and he wrote it many years later, but he was basically 10 years old when the Russians marched into Hungary. Mm-hmm. So he wrote the book detailing. It was actually they marched in March of 1944. The book starts a little before then and mentions some older dates, but it essentially really covers 1944 and 1945 until after the war. And so he details what the family went through, but he really goes into detail about what clothing they wore, what food they ate, and what music they listened to. But you can sort of tell through that what actions people took. And by the way, all the names he used different names for everybody. So we also had to sort of figure out who was who. But so we learned a lot more. So going back to my mother, I learned some from that trip to Budapest in 1990. I learned some from her best friend Ava. I learned a lot from letters that were in the box that were actually between my mom and dad, which I'll tell you about that first in a second. And then I learned about it from the book. And so putting all those pieces together, I think we have a pretty good picture.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm sure there was more. But so going back to sort of March of 1944, when they marched in, then the Nazis marched in headed by Adolf Eichmann, but the Arrow Cross were the Hungarian Nazis, and they had already sort of taken a foothold. So by the time the Nazis came in, they said, we don't have to do that much because the Arrow Cross and they were rabid and even worse. And so things started to happen very, very, very quickly. So in April, beginning of April or middle of April, they knocked on the door and they took my grandfather. They took him first to a prison, and then he went to a labor camp that was called Chapel Island, and they called that Hungary's Devil Island. It was horrible. And we know some of this from the letters, but then also, for example, Andras found a journalist who was also with my grandfather, mentions my grandfather, and wrote a book about this whole thing.
Wow.
And so we knew from there, that was beyond cruel. But then from beyond there, he was taken to Auschwitz. His train was actually turned back, but then 2 days later it went. We knew that he was in front of Mengele, and he was in his 50s at the time. So people over 50 were typically just directly sent to the gas chamber. He was not, because I think he was in great physical shape. He was a really good tennis player, and he just kept himself in good shape. So he didn't go to the crematorium right away, but he was worked to the bone, shall we say.
Yeah.
And at some point, we don't know why, he was then transferred to Dachau. And after Dachau, the family never saw him again. And we had a number of people look at the documents and so on. We have a lot of documents from there. We can't quite tell whether he either died at the end of the war, April 30th, basically 1945, was when Dachau was liberated. And I think it was the Americans that liberated Dachau. But they had, shortly before that, the Germans took 7,000 people on a death march. And so we don't know if he died on the death march or he died at Dachau. He had typhoid. And, they use people as experiments, and my guess is that he was used as an experiment. So the family never saw him. So going back to April, just how fast things moved. So he was taken to prison, I think it was April 19th. May 5th, my father got a knock on the door saying he has to go to a Nazi labor camp, and he had to leave by May 15th. So on May 14th, he proposed to my mother. So they had met in medical school.
Okay.
They were medical students. They had been dating about 18 months at that point. And he asked her to marry him. He asked her to marry him. And she said yes, defying the law of 1941 that forbid Jews from marrying Christians. So my mother was obviously a very strong woman.
Obviously, yes.
But here they were, they were 20 years old at the time.
Yeah.
So in 1944, they just turned their birthdays for November and December. So they hadn't even turned 20 at that point.
Oh, wow.
So they were 19-year-old kids. And he went off to labor camp. And that's when her best friend, who was also Jewish, came to her and asked her if she would move into a factory complex. And what happened, again, there's so many anti-Jewish laws from even going back to the 1920s. Mm-hmm. Hungary had one of the first numerous clauses, it was called. But starting like in the mid-1930s on, there were hundreds of like these anti-Jewish decrees, and it made Jews' lives really, really difficult. So at any rate, her friend was in love with a rabbi. And the rabbi had a friend who was actually Polish but owned a factory. I think it was a linen factory it was on the outskirts of Hungary. And because of the anti-Jewish laws, he had to shutter the factory. So here was this factory. It was a factory building and a house and then a smaller servants' quarters. And it was surrounded by a tall fence and had 2 guard dogs. So Ava was my mother's best friend. She asked if my mother would move in and hide her family, the rabbi's family, the factory owner's family, and it ended up being numerous other people. She hid a lot of people, and she and another medical student, we found out when they ran out of room at the factory, they would hide people in the histology lab at the medical school. Wow. So my father goes off to labor camp. My mother is now, she and her mother also, my grandmother and her brother moved into the factory. Her father had actually been taken to prison, even though he was not Jewish. He had been taken to prison because he was listening to a radio, and he was caught listening to Radio Free America and BBC World News. Wow. And that was against the law. So he was actually taken to prison and tortured in prison. And he was eventually let go, but he was, yeah. So you can see how difficult life was. So she's moved into the factory. Then in June, my father's family was very well to do. His great grandfather had built this home on one of the grand boulevards in Budapest. And it was, when I say home, it was really an apartment building. It was a 4-story apartment building, but only the family lived there. So each apartment was inhabited by a family member. So he lived there, his son lived there, his daughter, my great-grandmother Margit, and her family, and then my grandmother and my grandmother's sister and their family. So it was all family members in this huge apartment building. They had 5 days in which they had to leave everything and move into what was called a Yellow Star house. So the Yellow Star houses were actually unique to Budapest. They were houses, but instead of a ghetto, they would just take a house. And the idea was, rather than consolidating everything in one small area, to take over these houses throughout the city, because then maybe the Allies wouldn't bomb them. But, that was the thought. But the Yellow Star houses were still, they were really just a place to collect people and get them ready for deportation. Mm-hmm. That was the whole idea. And even though, by that time they knew they were losing the war, but they intensified the violence on Jews, basically. And it was horrible because a lot of those people, including, we think, my great-grandmother's sister, a lot of people were marched into the Danube and shot. So if they didn't, if they weren't deported.
Yeah.
So, the intensity was just unbelievable. But so at any rate, they had to move everything. They had to leave everything they knew, go to a Yellow Star house. There was 12 people in one room. And that was true throughout the whole house. So 12 family members. And in these houses, it was mostly women and children and the elderly, because every able-bodied man or woman was at a labor camp.
Yeah.
So they moved in, and I know my mother helped them move. I know that according to Gabor's book, and she played a big role. The Yellow Star houses were only safe for a certain amount of time. Then people had to leave because they were really just, the Nazis would just come in, or the Air Cross would come in, and all of a sudden they would steal things, and they would harass people, and it was just awful. So then they had to move, and that's what Gabor's book really gave us is the truth about how they had to move from place to place to place, and no place was really safe. So they had safe houses from the Swedish and Swiss consulate, but even those places weren't safe, and they were so packed, and the conditions were horrific, and there was no food, and really terrible. And then eventually, for example, my grandmother ended up going to the factory, and also eventually Gabor's family went to the factory later on. So my mother had hit a lot of people, but she wasn't safe either, because almost daily the Arrow Cross would come to the gate. Thank goodness for the dogs. The dogs would bark, and they would demand to search the house. And because of the dogs, my mother said that they would always say, can we put the dogs away before you come in? And that gave everybody time to get into their hiding places.
Yeah.
But there was, basically in the fall of 44, it was fine when the Americans and the British were bombing, because she said they bombed almost on schedule, and you sort of knew when it was coming. When the Russians took over, they didn't keep to any schedule, and they just bombed indiscriminately day and night. And what happened is the dogs became confused. So she said, she told me this story, and it is still with me now. She said, the Air Cross were at the door, and the dogs hadn't barked. So everyone just had to scramble like crazy. And, here she is trying to pretend that everything's okay. Mm-hmm. And she brings them into the kitchen, and the rabbi had left his siddur on the countertop. So she quickly grabbed it before they could see. But, it's like those small little details. Yeah. Had they actually seen what was there, everyone would have been shot. They would have torn through the entire place, and everyone would have been shot. So daily, she just, they risked their lives every single day. It was terror.
Yeah, truly.
And the hunger and the cold. It was one of Budapest's coldest winters. And as I said, Gabor was really focused on clothes. He talked about how my mother had given away her winter clothes to other people in need. Mm. So she only had a very light summer jacket, and she would go out daily to stand in line for food, to take messages to people, to do things, and in a summer jacket in the middle of the coldest winter in Budapest.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Your mother was a remarkable woman.
Yeah, she was.
That's amazing.
She really was.
When she was telling you this story, Did you know that your father was in a labor camp?
No.
Okay.
No. So what was very interesting, she told me that story back in 1990 when we were in Budapest. I had learned that my father was Jewish, but I will say I was in, I guess, my late 20s then. I was just turning 30, but my history wasn't good enough. So I really didn't understand. I'll never forget. She sort of said to me, she said, we were talking about my great-grandmother Margit, actually. And she sort of said to me off the cuff in a very humble way, she said, "Oh, by the way, I hid some people." And I didn't really understand what that meant. And had I really understood history and known more about it, I could have asked the questions. I never asked her, who did you hide? What was it really like? And so on. I mean, she told me that story and later on some other, small stories, but I didn't have the history. So that was one of the things that I did when I started really researching this. Not only did I research my own family's stories, but I really had to understand history. So I read a lot of history. I read every biography of the times that I could get my hands on, And so I could really understand the zeitgeist of the times.
Yeah.
And I did that for, going back to 1700s because I had to understand, in what context these stories really fit. And that's why I had never intended to write a book, but I needed to organize it somehow. So that's what happened. A book sort of came out of it.
I love it. I think it's so important.
Yeah.
For multiple reasons, but not least of which is your own family record.
Yes.
And posterity in that way. I mean, you're one of 7 kids.
Yeah.
And it is sad to think that your parents' story and legacy could have just gone with them had you not come across some of this information, and how many families' stories and legacies go with the people that carry them.
Absolutely. I think that happens a lot.
Yeah.
It happens a lot. I mean, trauma is a difficult thing to get through, and people just want to escape from it, and then these stories don't get told. And
yeah.
So important.
So important.
And especially today more than ever.
Yeah.
Today more than ever. I mean, I will tell you, a couple months ago, I did a talk at a very wealthy part of the U.S.
Okay.
And it was an interfaith youth group, so high schoolers. And I told the story of my parents, and they had not heard of the Holocaust.
That's wild.
Yeah. So or if they did, it was so whitewashed that they don't really understand.
Yeah.
And so it's so important today because people don't, we are repeating history. There is no question in my mind that we're repeating history right in this country. And if people really understood the consequences,
yeah,
that I think it would be different.
I agree. Yeah. We have been so removed from it, especially as Americans, I think.
Yes.
Because, I've visited parts of Europe. And so I went to Budapest in 2019. And my grandfather, who was my favorite person, was from Hungary.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Oh, neat.
And he left in 1956.
1956. Yeah, that's when a lot of people left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he spent 4 years in a prison there, in a communist prison there. But yep. I don't know what town he was from. Like, he wasn't from Budapest, but he was from a small town. But being in Budapest and visiting the headquarters of the Arrow-Cross Militia, which is now a museum, talking about the horrors that happened and that they, along with the Nazis and then the communist regime, inflicted upon the people of Hungary. And then to, you were talking about being shot into the Danube and the sculpture that's there, the shoes on the Danube.
The shoes on the Danube.
And so I'm just envisioning this in my mind. And I think people that grow up in these places that have remnants of the past at least have a visual touch point to that past. And I think as Americans, because we've never really had to contend with, our buildings that are bombed, except, it's the 9/11.
Right.
And you see how we speak about it as Americans. There's a lot of emotion and feelings about it, which I understand. However, it's the one thing that we can talk about. And you look at all of the other places in the world that have experienced stuff like that and worse.
Yes.
But we really don't have a genuine understanding, in my opinion, of what it looks like to live through something like that.
I agree, though I will also say just even, the communists really wanted to whitewash history too. Mm. And people were not allowed to practice religion. And they were just as anti-Semitic as the Nazis. So the treatment was horrible across the board.
Oh, yeah.
But so when Andras and I were doing all this research, Andras was doing a lot of his research at the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives. You probably went to the Dohane Synagogue. That's there. The museum and the archives are right there, sort of next to it. And they were, at the time, they were renovating the Rumbach Synagogue, which is, I don't know if you were there. It was in the middle of getting renovated in 2019.
Okay.
I don't think it didn't open until, I think it was 20 or 21. I don't remember.
Okay.
It was in the middle of COVID. But it's a beautiful synagogue. It's not as big, but it's architecturally stunning. Mm. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to put in a permanent exhibit to inspire others to look into their background, because there's so many Hungarians that actually have Jewish backgrounds but don't even know it because of the communists and the secrecy and so on. And so that exhibit is done solely on my family stories. So there's a permanent exhibit that's based on my family. It's called the Politzer Saga.
Oh my
just
goodness!
Like my book. Yeah.
Well, I have to go back and see that. That's amazing.
Yes. It's made of 10 films that are made up of these stories.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
I love that that this journey really seems to have had such a, I'm sure it was difficult, but it also seems to be very rewarding in certain ways as well.
Well, yes. I mean, I think right now where I am is, I would tell you that talk to the youth group just really shook me.
Yeah.
It really shook me. And so I'm actually working on a presentation for high schoolers, because I've been doing a number of book talks, but mostly they've been to adults. Mm-hmm. So I'm just creating something for high schoolers, because I think it's so important that they know these stories.
Yeah.
They have to understand the consequences of hate. It's just, and the courage and the resilience that people had to get through this time.
Truly.
So that's sort of where I am. I'm trying to live up to my mother's
legacy.
My mother's legacy, exactly.
That's pretty incredible. Now, did your father stay in the same labor camp? What happened, and no, he escaped, and he escaped with 6 people, but he escaped when the labor camp was bombed, and almost everyone died. Oh, geez.
So the fact that these 6 men survived was a miracle. So they escaped, but then they were caught 2 more times. So, what happened was, and I tried to push him on this, mm-hmm. and some other people tried to, actually for the exhibit, we had somebody come and film him, mm-hmm. and tried to push him, and he would not admit to anything. But we did at least learn the names of the other people. And one became a very famous economist, and he has on his website, the only thing he has, because I think they all had this pact of silence. They wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't talk about it to their kids, but he has on his website I was in the camp. It got bombed. I survived. It was a miracle. And that's basically all he has.
Okay.
So you don't know what happened. But there was one story that we learned, and this was, to me, this story tells it all. So all of them they were highly educated. They were fluent in German and so on. So I don't know how they got money and clothes and things like that to make it back, but they were on a train back to Budapest. And remember, these are 20-year-old young men, really brazen and whatever. So they sit in a car with a Nazi soldier and end up, because they're all fluent in German, they strike up this incredible conversation with him. And it was so lively that when the officer came to check on their tickets, he didn't bother them, which probably saved them, because I don't know if they had tickets or not. They very well might not have.
Yeah.
So at any rate, they arrive in Budapest. They get off on the platform, and the soldier says to them, he turns to them and says, "I've really enjoyed our conversation." And he says, "I wish all Hungarians were just like you."
Wow.
Is that incredible? I mean, that to me says it all.
Yeah.
We're just all people. We're all connected. And if we can have conversations, all these walls and all these, labels, they're just not reality. They're just made up.
They fall away so quickly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
So that story that's an incredible story.
Yeah. It truly, my stomach, I'm nervous. I'm so far removed from that situation, and I'm nervous just listening to it. Just the will to survive and the will to do whatever it takes is, again, something that I've never known. I've never had to know that.
Right.
And I think that, we can talk about human resilience and how incredible it is. And it is incredible. It deserves its own footnote. However, the fact that it has to exist in that capacity.
I totally agreed.
Is something we also have to talk about.
Right. Yeah. You're so right. We shouldn't need that.
Yeah.
We shouldn't need that. And I think that's why, there's so many programs about, or there used to be, about, getting different groups together and just having them talk in a very non-threatening way can just break down all those barriers.
Yeah.
And it's so important. And we have not learned to talk to one another.
Yes. We all have common ground somewhere.
Absolutely.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
I was speaking to, last year, I interviewed the CEO of the National Center on Child Sexual Exploitation.
Oh my.
And she was kind of speaking to that they would in their beginning days, they would hold these conferences, and they had this group of priests that would come. And then they had this group of women, lesbian feminist women that were coming into this. They were both coming to this conference because they wanted to help end child sexual exploitation. But on first seeing each other there, we're never mind, we can't do this. This is never going to work. But in being able to sit down and speak with each other, found so much common ground. And year after year, the same groups would meet up just to have these conversations.
Yep.
So you just don't know until you actually sit down and have a conversation with somebody.
Exactly. I think, just as you said, we have more in common than not.
Yes.
And so if we just try to break down the barriers and learn and understand and listen, and the world would be a different place.
Oh, gosh, yes. Truly. And I think that we can't change things from the bird's eye view. That's not where change happens, right? So
absolutely,
we just have to be committed to having those conversations.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So when you were growing up, not the details or anything, but was there a thought in your mind of like, oh, my parents are, immigrants, or, oh, my parents had a difficult life? Or was it very much just like, this is our normal, they don't really talk about it, we don't really know anything about it?
We didn't, I think when we were young, I don't have any of those memories. They never met, it was just a topic that wasn't talked about.
Yeah.
Actually what was talked about around the dinner table was medicine. My father wanted us all to be doctors, so it was like we started medical school around the kitchen table, around the dinner table. So we were just, we felt just like a normal family. The only thing is that, most of my friends had cousins and grandfathers and so on. We didn't. My grandmothers, as I said, lived with us, but we didn't have grandfathers. And here he was, but no one would talk about him.
Yeah.
No one would talk about him. And I remember once asking my grandmother about him, and she what she said was, oh, he was taken as a political prisoner and died. And that's all she would say. But, she said it in such a way that it was like, don't pry anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see the sadness on her face. And as a kid, I didn't want to make her sad.
Sure.
So I didn't push. And so nothing was ever talked about.
It's such a hard line to walk too, right? Because you don't want to push somebody's back into their trauma.
Right.
But you do want to know,
oh my God,
these stories.
If I had pushed my grandmother, as I said, I know my grandmother she loved telling stories. So I know she had incredible stories.
Yeah.
And she would have known Adam Politzer and all of his siblings, because he didn't die until 1920, and she would have been, 18 at that point. So she would have known these people, and to get the stories from her directly would have been so incredible.
Yeah.
But she was silenced.
And you don't know what you don't know. I mean, so my grandfather that was Hungarian and who escaped, he was put in prison for being a leader in the underground church at the time. And he did tell his story, but there's so much of it that is unknown because you don't know, especially as a kid, like you don't know what questions to ask.
Well, exactly.
Right?
That was my issue because, when I was with my mom in Hungary, I didn't know what questions to ask.
Yeah. I mean, it's this whole other world, this whole other reality.
Yeah.
And I find, as I got older, because I was very fortunate to have him for a large portion of my life, he had dementia and was forgetting things. He was mixing up timelines and stuff like that. So he was also an untrustworthy narrator at certain points, at a certain point too. So you couldn't necessarily ask him a straightforward question. But then when he passed, it was like, man, it's gone, like I know what I know. And I'm so happy that I have the knowledge I do have about him because I have something to carry forward.
Yeah.
But, I can't ask any other questions. So it's a hard place to be, to know that there's so much you want to know.
Right.
And, at a certain point, that opportunity isn't there anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because with the book, I've had a lot of Pulitzers reach out to me.
Really?
Yes. And I found a close cousin, but I've had a lot of Pulitzers reach out to me, and it was such a big, Adam Politzer was one of 14 kids. So it was such a big family that a lot of these Pulitzers probably are related. And even if they're not related, the Pulitzer name came from the town of Politz.
Okay.
So going back to the 1700s in Isaac's day, Isaac, for example, was known as Isaac, son of Moses. But then a decree came down from I think it was Emperor Francis at the time, and all Jews had to take a last name for tax control purposes. That was the only reason. And so often, they gave them names, and the names, in some cases they were able to choose, but not really. Isaac was not allowed to choose his name. He was told he was going to be Politzer from the town of Politz. And so a lot of these Politzers, including Joseph Politzer of the Pulitzer Prize, they're all from the town of Politz, and they all knew each other. So there's actually letters between Adam Politzer and Joseph Politzer.
Wow.
And Joseph Politzer's brother. And they called each other cousin. But you don't know if they were truly cousins.
Sure.
Or whether they were just close and, called each other cousin.
In community.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but we do know that Adam's youngest, the second youngest of the 14, his name was Zygmunt Politzer. And he was the one who wrote the book that we found called Our Family History. And he was married to Irma Politzer, and Irma Politzer was Joseph Politzer's cousin.
Okay.
So it's all of these connections.
It is connected, yes.
It's amazing, some of these connections that we found. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so fun. And I just wish people, I think there are a lot of people that do realize how incredible this is. And, I have nothing, as far as I know, like your family history, but I found out a couple years ago that my great uncle, I think was my great uncle, was a magician. And he was a pretty famous magician who worked with Houdini.
Wow.
And my aunt,
he was Hungarian then.
No. Sorry. My Hungarian grandfather was my step grandfather. So I don't have,
but
I'm
Houdini is Hungarian,
Oh, yeah. But this was in
the States.
Yeah. So my dad's family is Scottish. So he has a park named after him up in New York. Oh
my goodness.
And my aunt just casually dropped this one day. And I'm like, Dad, what? You didn't think to mention this? And I think so much of our history becomes banal to us because we just assume other people wouldn't be interested, or we assume that the younger generation doesn't care. And it's just not true.
Right.
And, we have to keep telling it. We need people in these families to continue carrying those torches.
I agree. It's so important. So important. Yeah.
So how was it, when you started this process, and even to now, with your siblings and your extended family, how was that process for them as well?
Well, it's really interesting. I'll go back to the cousin that I found out. It was wonderful. I mean, we've become close since. He actually has visited here twice, and he came to Hungary with me when we did a big celebration for the Rombach exhibit.
I'm sure.
And it was remarkable because he's interesting because he's in his late 80s. He grew up in Hungary, but he doesn't remember anything, and he didn't realize that he was Jewish either.
Wow. So
he eventually became a Protestant minister. And his wife, who he married, she grew up Christian, but converted to Judaism, which was funny. So, sort of the switch. But yeah, it's been wonderful getting to know him. And he is actually the great-grandson of Zygmunt and Irma Politzer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what was amazing in Hungary, I don't know if when you were in Budapest, you probably didn't go. There's a huge Jewish cemetery called the Cosmos Street Cemetery.
Okay.
And all of our family has these enormous tombstones that are beautifully decorated, or were. They're in horrible shape now. But so I took him to see that. And when he saw Zygmunt's and Irma, and then on it, he remembers so they had, I think, 4 or 5 children. And one of them was Margit, or Margit. And she married, I don't remember his first name, but Lederer was his name. And Miklos is my cousin. He remembers, going to their home and sitting on, there's some wonderful pictures of him sitting on his grandfather's lap.
Oh, wow.
And so when he saw their names on the tombstone. He was just so moved.
Wow.
As I was the first time I saw
Sure.
mine. I mean, it was just incredible to see their names there.
Yeah. There is a visceral, there is something to a place, you know, when you have history there or there's ancestry there. I absolutely believe that there is something, you know, there's something there. And I don't know what I would call it. And I don't know, you know, how to say it.
I think one of the things is it makes them real.
Yeah.
You know, this is not a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
They were real. Their names are on this tombstone,
Yeah.
and they are buried here. So just the fact that they're real, I think, it just makes a difference. And
Sure.
you know, just as you said, it's hard to put it into words, but it's very emotional.
Yeah.
It's very emotional.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So your parents, how did they end up coming over to the States?
Right after the war, you know, they were medical students, as I said. They had met in medical school, and my father actually got a scholarship to Zurich, which was a very big deal at the time because, you know, most people were not getting out. So he and my mother went to Zurich, and just in time, because then the communists sort of came down and no one was getting out. It was quite tragic. But they went to Zurich. They finished their medical studies there. Then they went to Paris and did like a fellowship at the Pasteur Institute. And then they were recruited here by Jefferson in Philadelphia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they came here as young physicians.
Did they get married right after the war?
That's a whole other story. So right after the war, my father, you know, they were all in this factory and there was no food. So my father and 3 other men went out looking for food, and they got captured by the Russians and ended up in a Russian labor camp. Because the Russians had this quota to fill. They had to capture so many Germans. And if they didn't have a German, they would just drag people off the street and capture them.
Oh, my word.
So that's a whole other story, that my father actually was able to escape from there because what happened is the rabbi was with them. The rabbi knew Yiddish, and one of the Russian soldiers knew Yiddish. So they finally, and this is after, you know, I don't know how long they were there, several days, if not weeks. They finally were able to find this Russian soldier and convince him that they weren't Germans.
Yeah.
So he gave them papers and let them go, but he said, don't go back to Budapest, go to Szeged, which is a town about an hour south of Budapest. An hour south by car. But then the rabbi went back to Budapest and told my mother and Ava where my dad was. So my mother and Ava hitchhiked, which was so dangerous back then.
Yes.
Can you imagine? Two young women. They were both beautiful, and Russian soldiers everywhere. But they ended up hitchhiking and going to Szeged. And when they got there, then a week later, my parents were married.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Just wow. And where did the conversion to Catholicism come?
Well, my mother was always Catholic.
Oh, okay.
My mother was always Catholic. They were actually married in a Catholic church.
Okay.
In Szeged. So, and my father, you know, before the war, right before, it was during the war, but Hungary hadn't gotten into the war. So like in 38, 39, my father converted. But it was a lot of Jews converted, but it was only on paper.
Yeah.
And it didn't mean anything. So, you know, his father and my grandmother converted and my great grandmother, but they really went back to just being, they didn't want to convert.
Yeah.
It was just to see if that made a difference,
Sure.
which it didn't.
But at the time, you know, how do you know? Trying to survive.
So he had officially converted, and then it was easy with my mother being Catholic. You know, it was just, it was sort of natural. He said, you know, I'm Catholic now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
well, that makes sense.
Held on to that story till his dying day.
Yes, he did. And, you know, I get it. I think, you know, my grandfather did not go through the same things. He was not Jewish. It was a different experience. Traumatic for
my
sure.
goodness,
But
for the communists, it was, yes.
But not the same thing at all. And I do remember, though, he went back to Hungary one time in, I think, the early 2000s. So like 50 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And he was terrified to go.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a child when he went, but I remember he was terrified to go. And just thinking back on that now as an adult, you know, how long that trauma does not go away.
It never goes away.
It does not
Never
go
goes
away.
away. Yeah.
So I think it's incredible that he even went.
Yeah.
But, and same with your parents to go back after
Yeah.
what they experienced there.
Right. Yeah. No, I remember the first couple times they went back, they were saying it was very scary. They actually went back before the wall fell.
Wow.
And that was very scary. But then after the wall fell, it was a lot easier, I think, on them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Amazing. Well, yeah. I mean, this is incredible. I love this story. I think
Thank you.
So many people are going to relate, just in the sense that our family histories carry so much of us.
Absolutely.
Right? We can't escape that. They inform everything.
Exactly.
So they're important, and we have to keep telling them and recording them. So we'll definitely link to the book in the show notes. Absolutely. Thanks. And is there a link to the exhibit that is in Hungary?
The best would be through my website.
Okay.
I've got a lot of information. It's just www.pollitzersaga.com, and it has a lot of information on the web, on the exhibit itself, and you can actually see some of the trailers.
Fantastic. Well, I know what I'm going to be doing this afternoon, but we'll definitely link to that in the show notes as well.
Great.
So I do have one question that I ask everybody at the end of each episode, which is, through the lens of your experience, what does compassion mean to you?
Oh my goodness, it's everything. It's so critical to have compassion for everybody. And you know, I'll tell you, it's how we were raised. My mother always raised us. She said, no matter what a person's the color of their skin, their ethnicity, their religion, their economic status, their, you know, whatever, you treat everybody with dignity, respect, and compassion. And if we were to do that, as I said before, we'd have a different world.
Truly.
Yeah.
Truly. Well, I think personally that stories are the way that we get there.
Agreed. Yeah. But you can't teach history and dates and facts and events. You know, you need to teach history through stories.
Yeah. The humanity of it.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much. This was
thank you.
Fantastic. I'm so excited to learn more about your family. And I just applaud you truly for the labor of love that it was to do all of that.
Thank you so much. It was a labor of love, but it was so wonderful for me to do it. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to The Human Experience. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family, share it on social media, and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also support the podcast financially by going to my website, thehxpod.com, linked in the show notes, and clicking on Donate. It takes a lot of time and resources to create this podcast, so every little bit helps. Everyone has a story, and I'd love to hear yours. So be sure to check out the show notes for more information about how to stay in touch. Do good and love well.